Today on In Your Face Anatomy, we are doing joints part 3, last part to the joints. Yeah, let's get to it. Alright, joints part 3, here we go. So with this one, we're looking at the 4 major joints. The shoulder, the elbow, the hip, and the knee. Alright, so out of the gate, all of these pictures are also fair game for the practical exams. And lots of pictures in this entire chapter for the practical exam. And these are all fair game. So make sure we're spending some time learning these pictures. So we're going to start with the shoulder joint. Shoulder joint is a ball and socket joint, of course, where the head of the humerus fits into the glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa of your scapula. It's got a pretty loose joint capsule to allow us a good range of motion. We've got some bursa to know, some ligaments to know, very wide range of motion. So on this picture here, we can see just a basic view of the shoulder joint itself, also known as the glenohumeral joint, with some of the bursa in there. I'm going to come back to this here in a minute when we get to the bursa. So great pictures here. Absolutely know these pictures. I'm going to put up practice sheets for you to practice labeling these guys, so make sure that we know it. All right, so let's start with some ligaments. So there's 4 different ligaments of the shoulder that you have to be able to identify by sight or definition. But it's not nearly as bad as it seems, especially if you have that foundation in bones that we just learned in the last chapter. If you don't have that foundation in bones, you're going to struggle a bit on this. With that being said, we're going to start with the coracohumeral ligament. So it's going to connect the coracoid process of my scapula to the greater tubercle of my humerus. So we absolutely learned about the coracoid process, and we learned the greater tubercle of the humerus. And so this ligament just runs in between the two, and it's kind of in the name. Coraco for coracoid process, humeral, the greater tubercle of the humerus, coracohumeral ligament. And this is going to strengthen the upper part of our joint capsule. And we can see that in our picture here, running in red there, running at the top of our joint. That's my coracohumeral ligament. Next up, we have the glenohumeral ligament. So it's going to run from that glenoid cavity or glenoid fossa to the lesser tubercle and the anatomical neck of my humerus. So glenoid cavity to the lesser tubercle and neck of the humerus. Now this one's pretty easy to spot, especially from the side view, because it has 3 bands of fibers, and we can see that in our picture there on the right, on the far right, in the middle, the glenohumeral ligament, and how those bands kind of stack on top of each other. Makes it easy to spot. All right, and that's it for the glenohumeral ligament. More shots showing some of these ligaments that you need to be familiar with. Let's talk about the last 2. You see on the right side at the bottom the glenohumeral ligaments and how it's a big ligament. It really is, wrapping around that glenoid cavity. All right, then we got our transverse humeral ligament. It runs between the lesser and greater tubercles of the humerus. So make sure you understand that. It runs between the lesser tubercle and the greater tubercle of my humerus. So the transverse humeral ligament only runs on the humerus. That's it. And it transverses between the 2 tubercles. So it does 2 things. One, it helps create a tunnel for the long head of my biceps muscle. And we can see that in our picture to the right, that transverse humeral ligament and the biceps tendon kind of poking out underneath it. But it also helps lock down and secure these other ligaments that are attaching to my greater and my lesser tubercles on the humerus, which was the first 2 ligaments that we just talked about. So transverse humeral ligament, small little ligament, easy to spot. It's only on the humerus, so that one's pretty easy to find. And then our last ligament that I'm going to hold you accountable for is my coracoacromial ligament. So this is going to run between my coracoid process and the acromion process. Coracoacromion, this is an easy one. Coracoid to the acromion. And this also helps protect the upper part of my joint capsule. We can see that in it's the yellow ligament running in between those 2 processes from my scapula. And that's it for the ligaments. So there's 4 ligaments that you need to be able to identify, but there's also 4 bursa. So I've got my subscapular bursa. Before I get into bursa, remember that the good thing about bursa is their name tells you where they're at. So subscapular bursa, remember sub means below or under. So subscapular, this is going to be under my scapula. That's what subscapular means, under my scapula. So we're looking for the bursa that's under the scapula. We can see that in our first picture here, and it's a pretty decent sized bursa poking out on the bottom down there. Then we got our subdeltoid bursa. So this is going to be under my deltoid. The deltoid is a muscle. It's your shoulder muscle. And so that's where I'm going to flip back real quick. And we can see at the top here, you can see that shoulder muscle in red. And my subdeltoid bursa tucked up underneath that. So it's really there to help protect the shoulder joint from that muscle when it contracts and you move your shoulder. And then we got our subacromial, so it's going to be under the acromion process. And we got our subcoracoid, under the coracoid process. So pretty easy. There's a pretty good shot of showing 3 of these bursa here in these pictures. But you can see how those bursa are tucked underneath just to help protect the joint, the shoulder joint itself, from these bony processes that are sticking out. And then we got some x-rays or some plain film showing the different structures of the shoulder. Now, the shoulder is considered a weak joint because it's mostly held together by muscles more than bony structures, just meaning that it can dislocate more easily than some of these other joints that we are about to talk about. So, in hindsight, for the shoulder, 4 ligaments, 4 bursa. Make sure you can spot them on the pictures and make sure you can find them or understand what I'm talking about on the written test. So, if I was to say which bursa runs between the joint capsule and the acromion process, well, it's going to be the subacromial bursa, as it's under the acromion process. So those are the kind of the questions to expect. I could easily say which ligament runs between the the glenoid cavity and the lesser tubercle or the anatomical neck of the humerus, and you would have to tell me that is the glenohumeral ligament on the written test. So different ways I can come at you. Not that much stuff to study here when it comes to these joints, so make sure that you can put the pieces together. All right, elbow's pretty easy. There's just 3 ligaments and then some fat pads to talk about for the elbow in total. But the first thing we need to understand is the elbow is actually 2 articulations. We have 2 different joints in our elbow. So we have the hinge joint that runs between my humerus and my ulna for those hinge type of movements, the flexion, extension. But then I also have a plane joint running between the humerus and the radius, and that is for rotation. So I can supinate or pronate my hand as I need to with the plane joint. So I can move my arm in all different directions or move my hand and my wrist in all different directions because of these 2 different joints that we have with the elbow. So the first thing you need to know, elbow is a hinge joint and a plane joint. All right, first ligament out of 3 is the ulnar collateral ligament. We can see it right in the middle there. The good thing about the ulnar collateral ligament, just like the ulnar bone makes a U, so does my ulnar collateral ligament there. Make sure you can see the U. They have the elbow flexed, so it looks more like a C in this picture, but if the elbow was hanging down, it would absolutely look more like a U. But even as the C, you can still kind of see the U shape to it. None of the other elbow ligaments look anything like that, so it's pretty easy to spot. So 2 portions, anterior portion connecting the medial epicondyle of the humerus to the media ulna, where the posterior portion connects the medial epicondyle of the humerus to the olecranon process of the ulna. So 2 different portions for my ulnar collateral ligament. All in all, this one's pretty easy to spot out of the gate. Then I have my radial collateral ligament, just running between the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and the annular ligament, so it just runs in between the 2, hitting the radius primarily, and the connecting the radius and the humerus together. Then I got my annular ligament, and it's pretty easy to spot because you can see it running over the top of the head of the radius, and that just helps secure that radial head in place because it's going to be rotating around in a circle because this is the joint for supination and pronation, so we need to lock that down. So in the first picture, you can see it coming over the top of the head of the radius. In the second picture, you can see how the annular ligament comes down and attaches to the radial collateral ligament. So that's a pretty decent way to connect the 2. You can easily find the ulnar collateral ligament because of the U. then the other two ligaments are attached to each other. So you get the radial collateral running from the radius to the humerus, and then the annular ligament going over the top of the radius itself, locking it down in place. Now we're pretty familiar with all of these bones now. The distal end of my humerus has a lot going on. The proximal end of my ulna and radius have a lot going on. So we got a lot of little bony outcroppings sticking out. And to help protect that, we use fat pads. We use fat pads down there to help everything move accordingly in order like we want it to be moving without getting snagged up or injured on any of these bony processes. And that's it. So for the elbow, we got 3 ligaments and fat pads. Next up is the hip. Hip's pretty easy. Head of the femur fitting into the acetabulum. So the first 2 components of the hip joint that I want you to know is the ligamentum capitis, which attaches to the femoral head and carries blood vessels to the femoral head. So it helps secure the femur in the socket, and it helps feed the head of your femur at the same time. And it comes in, if you look at the picture on our right, you can see ligamentum capitis coming in from the wall of the acetabulum, coming up, and then it plugs into that little fovea capitis, that little indentation on the head of our femur. That's where my ligamentum capitis is going to plug into. Then I got my acetabular labrum. So this is just a labrum in your acetabulum is all. It helps deepen the acetabular cavity, and it helps secure the femoral head in place. And so it's a thin white outline. It's kind of hard to see, but it's a thin white outline along the edge of your acetabulum, and that just provides a little bit more friction in there and helps secure that femoral head into place so your hip isn't constantly popping out of socket. So with our hip joint, now that we've got our 2 basic structures helping secure the femoral head into the acetabulum, then there's 3 ligaments that we need to know. So first up is my iliofemoral ligament. We want to make note this is the strongest ligament in the body. Iliofemoral is the strongest ligament in the body. And as its name is going to suggest, it's going to run from your ilium, from your ilia bone in your hip, to the femur. Ilium to your femur. So it runs from the anterior inferior iliac spine, or the AIS. So it's one of the iliac spines, to the intertrochanteric line. So inter just means between, trochanteric, between the trochanters of your femur is where it's going to run, and that's where it attaches. And we can see in our picture here, we've got 2 sections. We've got an anterior view and a posterior view. On the anterior view, the good thing about the hip joint ligaments is, like my iliofemoral, it's the only ligament that actually comes up and attaches to that ilium bone. You can see the ilium bone, the big wide part of your hip. The only ligament that attaches to that ilium bone is your iliofemoral ligament. But it also kind of wraps around the back, and then we can jump over to the posterior view picture, and it covers the top part of that around the neck and the bottom of the head of your femur as it wraps around, just to help further secure that in place. Then I've got my pubofemoral ligament extending between the pubis and the iliofemoral ligament, and the ischiofemoral ligament running from the ischium to the joint capsule itself. So again, the pubofemoral ligament, if we look at our picture here, it's the only ligament that comes up and attaches to the pubic bone. So that makes it super easy to spot. Attaching to the pubis, that's got to be my pubofemoral ligament. Then my ischiofemoral ligament, remember your ischium is your butt bone. So this is going to be on the back side. So we've got to jump over to the posterior view, and it's the bottom half of that ligament that wraps around the back side of your hip. So the top half is the iliofemoral ligament. The bottom half is going to be my ischiofemoral ligament. And that's it for the hip. So I've got those 2 structures that help secure the hip in, ligamentum capitis and acetabular labrum. And then I have my 3 ligaments, the iliofemoral, the pubofemoral, and the ischiofemoral. This was an easy one. And then I've got some plain films here showing some of the structures of the hip, nothing crazy. More structures of the hip, nothing crazy. And then I've got the knee joint. So the knee joint is the largest joint, it's the most complex synovial joint. We've got the condyles of my femur and my condyles of my tibia coming together, sitting on top of each other to make the knee joint. And at the same time, the femur articulates in the front with the patella. So I've got my patella bone in play as well. And that's going to get us into the first ligament. So we're going to do the knee because it is a bit more complicated in sections. So the front section is all about this patellar ligament. So it continues down from your quadriceps. Remember, your quads are the big muscles on the front of your thigh. As they come down, they form your muscular tendon, and our patellar ligament becomes that. That tendon becomes my patellar ligament. It wraps the patella bone up in it, and it goes down and attaches to the tibial tuberosity down on our tibia bone. So the front, we see my patellar ligament. So in this picture, in the middle picture down here at the bottom, you can see where they cut the patellar ligament. It would continue up, but it would cover all of those other structures in there that we need to be looking at. So they've cut the patellar ligament just to get it out of the way so we can see the other structures. But there it is, and so you can see how it would cover up the entire front of my knee. Now we're going into the deepest part of my knee joint. So I've got cruciate ligaments that help prevent displacement, and they're named to their attachment point on the tibia. So I've got my ACL, also known as my anterior cruciate ligament, originating from the anterior intercondyle, so between the condyles of my tibia, and extends up to the lateral condyle of my femur. And then I've got my posterior cruciate ligament, connecting the posterior intercondyle area between the condyles of the tibia to the medial condyle of the femur. So these two ligaments, my anterior and my posterior ligament, form an X almost between those two bones. They really help anchor those bones together, secure them in place. Let me jump forward and find, here we go. So if you go all the way over to the far right side, we've taken everything else out except for those cruciate ligaments, and you can see how they form that X, securing the bones in place. So the one in the front is going to be my anterior cruciate, my ACL. The one in the back is going to be my posterior cruciate ligament. That is my PCL. Went the wrong way. Nope, now I went the wrong way. There we go. Now also, in the middle, separating those two bones, because remember, we put the condyles of our femur on top of the condyles of our tibia, and we don't want bone rubbing on bone because that's going to be painful, make every step hurt. So we use menisci. Meniscus help separate the articulating surfaces, help align them. They help distribute your body weight. Meniscus super important to keep those bones from rubbing against each other. There's little depressions on the bones that you can see where the menisci actually fit into. So the one on the medial side, in between my femur and my tibia, that's going to be my medial meniscus. We can see it in the picture over here. The one on the lateral side, separating the two bones, is going to be my lateral meniscus. So medial, lateral meniscus, boom, boom, boom. I know that's the lateral meniscus because the fibula bone gives it away. The fibula bone is your lateral leg bone. It's on the outside of your leg. So that's got to be the lateral side. So that's got to be my lateral meniscus right above it. That's my giveaway. So that's the deep structures to my knee. Now we're going to jump around to the back of the knee, and I've got my popliteal ligaments. There's two at the back of the knee. Remember, popliteal means back of the knee. Oblique means diagonal. If you don't know that yet, you need to know that. Oblique means diagonal. And so when we look at the back of the knee, running from the lateral condyle of my femur to the head of the tibia in this big diagonal line, it's a big thick ligament there. That's my oblique popliteal ligament. We know it's the oblique because it's running diagonally. Then I've got my arcuate popliteal ligament running from the lateral condyle of the femur to the head of the fibula. Arcuate popliteal ligament. This is a smaller one. It's Y-shaped. Once you spot it there, it's pretty easy to find. And those are really the only two ligaments on the back of the knee that we have to worry about. Oblique popliteal and arcuate popliteal ligament. And so that's on the picture to the right. That's the posterior view. Now we're going to jump over to the picture on the left here and talk about our collateral ligaments. So remember, with the collateral, we're talking about the sides. So this is going to be on each side. So on the medial side, I've got my tibial collateral ligament, also known as my medial collateral ligament. You'll see this a lot as the MCL, the MCL. And it runs from the medial condyle of the femur to the medial condyle of the tibia. So it's just connecting the two bones, securing the sides on the medial side of that knee. Then I've got my fibular collateral ligament. aka the lateral collateral ligament. You also see this as the LCL, connecting the lateral condyle of the femur to the head of my fibula bones. And you can see that in our side view picture as well. Tibial collateral, fibular collateral. And then lastly, we have some bursa. So for the knee joint, the bursa is all about the patella. So supra, remember, is just short for superior or above. Pre is in front of, and infra or before. Pre is in front of or before, and infra is short for inferior or below. So suprapatella tells me this is going to be above the patella, and we're going to find this between the femur and the quadriceps. We jump over at our picture. Nice big suprapatella bursa there. Prepatella is going to be between the patella and the skin, so this is going to be in front of or before the patella. Then my infrapatella is going to be between the tibia and the patella ligament itself, and so that's a smaller one down below the patella. Super easy, the patella of the bursa of the knee. Once you start looking at these, super easy to spot. All right, so there's the knee on plain films. We can see where those menisci would sit in between those bones, help separating those bones. We got a decent joint space in there, which tells us our menisci are still good. And then our fibula bone poking up on the back, so I know which side is the medial meniscus and which one is the lateral meniscus, because that fibula gives it away. Back to this picture, we already talked about the one on the far right, showing those cruciate ligaments. We move over one picture to the left there, we can see the menisci in there, and then some of our collateral ligaments. We continue, we've put the patella back on, and we've got some of those collateral ligaments and meniscus still visible. And then all the way to the left is just a knee that hasn't been dissected yet. Posterior view, just a different angle showing some of the cruciate ligaments and how they absolutely form that X to help secure those two bones into place. All right, some joint pathology real quick. Bursitis, inflammation of a bursa. You may also see this as epicondylitis in the real world. And it's typically caused by overuse or a stress injury. So if you're doing some repetitive motion over and over and over again, that can absolutely lead to bursitis. So we see this in conditions like tennis elbow or golfer's elbow, are pretty common bursitis issues. Arthritis, basic, a disease that causes inflamed, swollen, and painful joints. It's just wear and tear on your joints. Wear and tear on your joints is arthritis. Osteoarthritis is the most common type of arthritis. Degenerative disorder that occurs with aging. Again, we get wear and tear, but we also lose our joint space with osteoarthritis or OA. Typically on x-rays, we're going to see the medial aspect of the joint space is lost. And so we can see, again, the fibula bone gives it away as the lateral side. And if we jump up to the joint, we can see we got decent joint space above the fibula on each of these legs. But if we move over to the other side, the medial aspect of our knee, we can see the joint space is much lessened on one and then completely gone on the other. But because we have that joint space on the medial aspect of our knees lost, we can make that diagnosis of OA. So this is something where we're looking for something definitive, specifically losing that joint space on the medial side. And then with rheumatoid arthritis, we want to know, 1, this is an autoimmune disorder. 2, our synovial membrane becomes inflamed and thickened. And 3, it forms a mass called a pannus. So your synovial membrane becomes a pannus. And as it thickens, if it thickens enough, it can kind of dislodge and make your bones grow in funky directions, because we don't have that joint security anymore, because that synovial membrane has thickened so much. It just kind of dislocates or moves the bones in a direction that we don't really want them going into. And that is joints part 3. So we got test and practical coming up. Make sure you know the pictures. Make sure you know the PowerPoint. Don't underestimate it. Good